The first image is not the woods, it is a piece of paper creased, yellowed, and swollen by years of damp air laying under the harsh white of an evidence room lamp. The camera holds on it long enough for the handwriting to become a voice. The graphite letters are pressed deep into the fibers, as if written against the grain of panic. The air is heavier, now it hums below our feet. Jonah says it's the earth singing, but the notes are wrong. The words shake as they're read aloud, and though they belong to a vanished class in 1984, they arrive now in the present like they've been waiting for the right set of ears. We're told that these pages 13 in total were sealed inside the hollow of an ancient pine discovered by a pair of hikers in the late 1990s. The tree had grown around them, its bark folding in slow layers over the decades, hiding the notebook, as if the forest had decided to archive its own crime. The voice continues naming them, one by one, almost like a roll call that no one will answer. Ms. Marianne Cole, 32, a science teacher with a quiet obsession for field work. Jonah, 15, known for sketching more than listening. Aria, 14, quick-witted, never without her wristwatch. Miguel, 16, skeptical of adults, but fiercely protective of the group. Lena, 15, the amateur photographer, whose lens saw more than she wanted to believe. Paul, 14, the youngest, with a knack for noticing the wrong things. First 6 names, 6 chairs in a classroom that would stay empty after October 12, 1984. The narrator guides us to the night the notes were found. A storm had passed through, felling part of the pine's upper branches. The hikers, brothers in their 50s, noticed the tree's scar, a long vertical split where the wind had wrenched the bark open. One of them reached in and touched paper, dry and warm, impossibly preserved. They pulled free a notebook swollen at the spine, its pages smelling faintly of iron and sap. Inside, hurried diagrams of tree rings, maps with places crossed out, lists of soil pH readings, and then without transition, personal confessions, drawings of strange symbols, and pleas written in shaky hands. The most unnerving line was written near the end: "If you find this, it means the tree kept its promise. We're still walking." We cut back to 1984, a wide shot of the town, faded signage, telephone poles swaying, the sound of a school bus somewhere in the distance. The day they vanished wasn't stormy or strange, it was unremarkable in every way that should have made it safe. The group had been out studying the forest for a routine science field trip. By late afternoon, they hadn't returned. Search parties swarmed the area for weeks, combing through undergrowth, mapping creek beds, knocking on old cabin doors. They found nothing: no shoes, no backpacks, no footprints beyond a certain ridge. The hollow pine stood less than a mile from the trailhead, but nobody thought to split it open. Nobody wondered if it had swallowed something whole. The narrator lingers here on the cruel symmetry. The tree was both witness and vault, standing in plain sight while the town grieved around it. We return to the evidence room. In the late 90s, the recovered notebook lies open, pages under glass, while a forensic analyst glances between the writing and a typed transcript. The camera edges closer to the drawn symbol, repeated throughout the pages, a circle with a small notch, always in the same place, like a clock stopped at one time. The narrator suggests something quietly terrifying: these notes were not written at once. The pencil strokes vary in depth, the handwriting shifts subtly. It's as if the notebook was returned to the tree more than once by people still alive somewhere beyond where the maps end. In the silence that follows, we hear the faint suggestion of wind in the pine canopy. The frame freezes on the symbol, letting the question settle in: if these pages were a message, who was the intended reader? Someone from the outside world, or the forest itself? This section closes with a final image, a slow tracking shot into the trees, hollow as it is today, dark, resin-scented, and deep enough that the light disappears before the camera reaches the end. The narrator's voice softens: some believe the tree guarded the truth for 15 years, others believe it is still holding more than paper. The screen fades, and the next chapter will pull us backward into the classroom, where the story began, before the notes, before the hollow, before the hum. The world before the disappearance is lit in the cold blue-white of 1980s fluorescent tubes, the kind that hum faintly and flicker when the janitor hasn't replaced them in months. Chalk dust hangs in the air like a slow snowfall, catching the light in drifting motes. It is October 10th, 1984, 2 days before the trip. Ms. Marianne Cole stands at the front of room 2B, diagramming the structure of a lichen on the blackboard. Her hair is pinned back in a loose knot, strands catching the light, eyes scanning the class as if she's trying to measure not only their comprehension but their temperature, emotional and otherwise. Marianne is the kind of teacher who addresses students by name even when scolding them, and who sees small patterns in behavior that others miss. She notices that Jonah in the third row sketches the shape of the projector lens instead of the diagram. She notices Arya tapping her wristwatch in quiet rhythm, counting something no one else hears. She notices that Miguel has positioned his chair at an angle as though ready to leave. The school itself is a collage of faint sounds: lockers slamming, the squeak of basketball shoes on the gym floor, the ringing of a bell that always comes just a fraction too loud. The hallway walls are lined with fading posters. Science is the future in thick block letters, safety goggles, happy eyes in awkward rhyme. The class schedule is tacked above the chalkboard, its paper curling at the edges on the back bulletin board pinned in the corner is a map of the county's nature preserve. A few areas have been marked in red ink and then crossed out with a thick black line. Most students assume these are private property zones or unsafe trails. Marian never confirms or denies it. The students themselves are carrying invisible weights. Jonah, whose parents fight in muffled voices behind closed doors, finds relief in drawing because paper doesn't answer back. Arya, the perfectionist, measures her world in seconds and microseconds, tracking everything from how long the bus takes to arrive to how long a teacher pauses between sentences. Miguel, protective older brother to three siblings, distrusts adults' promises, especially those that start with "don't worry." Lena, caught between immigrant parents' expectations and her own craving for solitude, finds the camera lens more trustworthy than her own eyes. Paul, youngest of the group, still believes in hidden doorways and the possibility that the world is stranger than adults let on. The field trip itself feels benign on paper. Marianne has submitted the required forms, listed objectives: measure soil pH at 3 locations, identify and sketch lichen species, test acoustic dampening in dense pine, stands by clapping at set intervals. Her notes to herself include a 4th unlisted goal: observe variations in sound reflection within mapped area of old quarry land. She does not share this with the principal nor with the parents. She believes it will seem too esoteric, too impractical for a high school class. We see snippets of conversation from that week, tiny foreshadowing threads. The custodian warns her almost casually, some parts of that forest aren't on the maps they give you. They were here before the maps. A guidance counselor suggests moving the trip closer to the park's visitor center. Marianne smiles politely and declines a substitute teacher, overhearing her lesson, asks, "Don't you worry about getting lost?" Marianne replies, "Not if you're listening to the right thing." That Friday, they prepare their gear: notebooks, pencils, a compass, a portable pH kit, a Polaroid camera. Miguel complains about having to carry the water jug. Lena fusses with the camera's flash. Paul spins a spare pencil in his fingers and asks, "If the forest is quiet, how will we know if it's too quiet?" Marian doesn't answer right away. She just says, "You'll feel it." The fluorescent lights hum on, dust falls through their beams. Outside the window, the wind moves through the schoolyard trees in a slow ripple, like breath through the ribs of something sleeping. This section closes on a still image of the classroom after the final bell. Empty chairs, chalk residue on the board, the map on the wall showing the preserve with those blacked out zones. The camera lingers as if the room itself already knows it will not see those 6 faces together again. The morning of October 12th, 1984 arrives with a sky the color of tin, not stormy, but dense, as if the light has to push harder to reach the ground. Breath shows in the air as the group gathers at the trailhead. Marianne, with her clipboard and a canvas satchel, the 5 students with backpacks, and the impatient bounce of youth, trying to hide curiosity under casual disinterest. The forest greets them with the smell of pine resin and damp earth. Shoes crunch over a mosaic of needles, twigs, and the occasional frost-slick leaf. For the first 10 minutes, it's all chatter. Miguel teasing Paul about bringing too much candy. Arya explaining how tree growth rings can reveal past droughts. Jonah already slowing behind to sketch the texture of bark. Then it comes, the sound. At first, they think it's wind in the canopy, a long, low vibration that rises and falls irregularly, but there is no corresponding sway in the treetops. The sound seems to come from the ground itself, as if the soil is resonating like the inside of a drumhead struck from far away. Marianne pauses, hand raised. She crouches, presses her palm flat against the earth. "Feel it," she says. The students mimic her palms to dirt. The vibration is faint but certain, and it has an odd rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. Paul says it feels like something breathing. Lena compares it to standing too close to a bass speaker. Miguel, ever skeptical, insists it's distant machinery from the quarry, though they're miles from any active site. Marianne doesn't argue she simply notes the time, the weather, the temperature, and the compass reading. The needle shivers, ticks left, then steadies. She makes another note, hum fluctuates. With compass movement test later, they begin their first experiment. Soil pH readings at 3 marked points along the trail. Arya measures while Jonah records. The numbers come back inconsistent. 2 readings, a full point more acidic than expected. Marianne attributes it to mineral variation, though her brow furrows as she marks the data. From there, they move to the acoustic dampening test. Stand 15 meters apart, clap once, and measure how far the sound travels before it vanishes into the forest density. It works as predicted until Paul notices something odd. When they clap facing east, the echo returns late and thin. Facing west, the echo arrives too early, almost overlapping the initial sound. Facing south, there is no echo at all. Miguel mutters, maybe it's the trees messing with us, Marianne says almost to herself, or the ground ass. They continue deeper distances, feels slippery. The group agrees they've walked at least 2 miles, yet the ridge they're aiming for remains small on the horizon. Arya times their pace. With her watch, 45 minutes at a steady walk should have covered it, but the landmarks seem to repeat. A fallen birch with 2 main branches, a boulder shaped like a crouching figure, the exact arrangement of 3 young pines. Lena takes a Polaroid of the boulder. 10 minutes later, they pass it again. She takes another. Determined to compare them later, Jonah begins sketching fungal growth on a nearby tree stump. The rings of tiny mushrooms spiral inward, tighter and tighter toward the center. He shows it to Marianne, who nods, but keeps glancing toward the ridge, as if measuring the weight of a decision she hasn't voiced. Paul keeps stopping to listen to the hum. It's getting faster, he says. Marianne finally agrees. The 3-beat pattern is now 2 beats, pause, 2 beats again, like a slow-down metronome, speeding up. Miguel wants to turn back. Marianne says they will after lunch, but first she wants to reach a point where the creek bends north. From there, she explains, we'll be able to triangulate the source of the sound. Lunch is brief, sandwiches eaten, standing up, water gulped. Without much conversation, the forest is no longer background. It feels watchful, a little too still between each gust of wind. It's then they find it, a pine older and broader than the rest, its trunk marked by a long-healed scar from a cut made decades before. Near the base, a dark opening yawns, not wide enough for a person, but large enough for Jonah to crouch and peer inside. His voice echoes back, soft and hollow. Marianne crouches, running her fingers along the interior. Dry, she notes, despite the weather. She looks at the group. We'll use this as a weatherproof cache. Put your notes inside. While we move further along, we can collect them on the way back. The students slide their notebooks into the hollow. Arya, last to place hers inside, pauses. There's something drawn in here, she says, pointing to a faint charcoal marking a circle with a small notch. No one can guess its meaning. The hum swells again, as if in response. They shoulder their packs and continue toward the creek, leaving the hollow pine behind. The camera lingers on the dark mouth of the tree, the notebooks inside stacked neatly, their pages whispering faintly against one another in the shifting air. They don't mean to linger at the pine, but the tree has a way of asking for attention without sound. Even as they step away, the hollow seems to hold on to them like a doorway they've left ajar. The trunk is massive, its bark ridged and furrowed like muscle. The old scar from logging decades earlier runs diagonally, a pale seam against the dark skin of the tree. Just inside the hollow, the air is unexpectedly warm, faintly sweet, with resin and something metallic, almost like old coins. Jonah crouched again. Notes how the inside walls are smooth, not raw splintered wood, but polished in a way that suggests touch too deliberate for nature. He runs his hand along the interior, finds the faint charcoal ring. Arya had seen its precision, near-perfect circle, broken only by a small notch at the top, like the 12 o'clock mark on a clock face. A teachable moment. Marianne uses the hollow as an impromptu lesson. Trees are archivists. They record injury and recovery in their rings. They can even protect what's placed inside them: seeds, tools, even messages. She tells the story of early loggers marking trees as trail guides by hollowing them slightly and leaving tokens inside: nails, coins, even rolled up notes. Most were later forgotten, swallowed as the tree grew over the openings. Her tone is calm, instructional, but she keeps glancing toward the ridge beyond the creek. The students take out their notebooks one by one. They slide them inside the hollow. Jonah's filled with sketches of spirals and bark patterns. Arya's neatly tabbed with times, compass readings, and annotations in tidy block letters. Miguel's messier with hurried entries and small doodles in the margins, Lena's peppered with Polaroid inserts taped at the edges, Paul's containing more questions than answers. Mariana's own notes go in last. She pauses, looking at the symbol again, then places her notebook so it rests directly against it. The sound grows steadier as they step back. The hum they've been hearing shifts, no longer rising and falling unpredictably, but now holding a steadier pulsing tone. It's faint, but enough that they all feel it in their chests. Arya glances at her watch. The beats are sinking, she says, almost exactly 2 seconds apart. Miguel jokes about the forest having a heartbeat, but his voice doesn't carry the weight of a joke anymore. They move on toward the creek, deciding to circle back in the afternoon. Paul hesitates, looking back at the hollow. What if someone takes our stuff? Marianne smiles faintly. Who would be out here? She says. Besides, the tree's holding it for us, a tree with a past. As they cross the creek narrow enough to jump, the camera cuts to Mariana's memory. 2 years earlier on a solo survey, she had found this same pine. The symbol had been there then, too faint but visible, and the hollow had been empty except for a brittle fragment of paper too faded to read. She had wondered if it was some forgotten logging marker, but the precision of the circle bothered her too clean for something drawn in the field. She never told the school or the park rangers she had intended to return with better equipment. Now, standing on the opposite bank, she feels an unease she doesn't voice. It isn't just that they've left their work behind, it's that they've given the forest a record of themselves. The ridge beyond the group climbs the low ridge Marianne had pointed out. The ground is damp, the undergrowth thick. The hum is louder here, though there's no visible Sorcino machinery, no wind in the branches, no water running underground that they can see. Jonah stops to sketch the view back toward the pine. From here, the tree looks impossibly small, swallowed by the rest of the forest, as though the distance has doubled since they left it. Lena snaps a photo of the ridge, then one of the creek below. She shakes the Polaroids, watching them develop. One shows the creek clearly, the other, taken seconds later, shows the same frame, but the water surface is perfectly still with no ripples from where Miguel had just splashed a rock. And she frowns, says nothing. The camera lingers as they move on. The documentary's focus returns to the hollow pine. There is no one nearby. The forest is silent except for the hum, now so low it could be mistaken for a deep inhale. Inside the hollow, the stacked notebooks shift almost imperceptibly, as if adjusting. The charcoal ring marking seems darker in the dim light, and now, though no one is there to see, a faint hairline crack runs outward from the notch at the top of the circle. It's subtle, small enough to miss, but it suggests something. This tree may not just be keeping their notes safe, it may be keeping count. The forest is behind her for now, but in Marianne Cole's mind it has never really been far. Before she was a teacher, she was a graduate student in environmental acoustics, a field that seemed to most people like a strange overlap between botany and music theory. Her focus was on how landscapes distort and bend sound. She could talk for hours about how snow absorbs certain frequencies, how cliffs send echoes and spirals, how dense pine forests dampen human voices, but not bird calls. She still keeps the remnants of that past life in a shoebox at home, a battered sound level meter, a compass with a crack across the glass, a folded topographical map annotated in 2 sets of handwriting. Hers and her advisor's. The edges of the map are worn soft, as if handled too often. The incident she never mentioned in her second year of graduate work. She joined a survey in a research grove known for infrasound, low-frequency vibrations below the threshold of human hearing. One afternoon, she stepped off the marked trail to collect readings and lost track of the group. She swore she could hear their voices in the distance, faint but clear, calling her name. She followed them for over an hour before realizing the calls were looping, repeating in an identical pattern down to the pauses between words. By the time she found her way back, the others were panicked, convinced she'd been missing for only 20 minutes. She didn't tell them about the voice loop. She also didn't mention the compass in her pocket, which spun erratically for days afterward. Even indoors, letters and grants. Mariana's passion for sound patterns bled into her teaching. She corresponded by mail with a former colleague, Dr. Wendell Carr, about possible correlations between infrasound and disorientation in forests. The letters, written in tight script on cream stationery, still sit in a manila folder in her desk drawer. Carr encouraged her to apply for funding to explore the phenomenon in the county's nature preserve, citing a 1911 report of geographic hum in the same area. She submitted a grant proposal to the school board. It was denied, too speculative, they said. The board recommended she stick to standard curriculum and established field methods. But Marianne never stopped paying attention. On every field trip, she carried a second private notebook in it. She documented anomalies, echoes returning from unexpected angles, compasses wavering, pH levels fluctuating. In tight proximity, she often tested these herself using her students. Experiments as cover the tree in her memory, the hollow pine, they found that day was not new to her. She had stumbled across it during a solo hike years earlier, drawn to the unusual texture of its bark and the old logging scar running diagonally like a healed wound. When Shed first leaned in to examine it, Shed found a small scrap of paper deep inside, edges frayed, handwriting faded to near invisibility. It was too brittle to remove. Intact, all she could make out was a single mark, the same circular ring with a notch at the top. That symbol lodged itself in her mind enough that she copied it into her private notebook and began looking for it elsewhere. Over the years, she found it scratched into a boulder near the creek, faintly etched on a rusted water tank by the old quarry, even chalked onto a fence post outside town. Always the same shape, always slightly hidden, the promise she made herself when she first started taking students into the field. Marianne swore Shed never pushed them too far. The memory of getting lost in that research grove off the way sound could betray you was still sharp. She kept trips short, routes simple, and always turned back at the first sign of bad weather. But the hum they'd been hearing that day, it was too strong, too regular, too precise to ignore. The fact that it seemed to intensify near the hollow pine made it impossible for her to treat it as coincidence. She told herself, Shed, keep them safe. They'd collect more data, then return before anyone at the school noticed. They were late. Unspoken guilt somewhere beneath her rational mind, though. There was something else, a quiet, selfish hope that this trip would give her the proof Shed been chasing for years, proof that landscapes could manipulate perception, proof that sound could bend reality, or at least our sense of it. She told herself she needed that evidence for science, for understanding, but part of her also wanted to vindicate the version of herself who'd been dismissed as eccentric and overcomplicating simple nature walks. It was this private, unvoiced need, the one she never shared with her students, that tilted her decisions in the hours to come, a foreshadowing look as the group moved deeper into the forest. Marianne walked a few paces behind. She studied the backs of their heads, Jonah's hair catching the light, Arius' watch glinting, Miguel's shoulders squared, Lena's camera strap swinging, Paul hopping over roots. She thought about the hollow pine behind them, holding not just their notes, but an unintentional time capsule of who they were in that moment. In her private mind, she wondered if the tree would remember them. When 6 people disappear in a town of less than 5,000, the absence echoes louder than their names. It seeps into grocery store aisles, into church pews, into the space between small talk at the post office. It lives in the pauses, the glances over shoulders, the words people choose not to use anymore. By the second night after the field trip, the official search had begun. Sheriffs, deputies, volunteer firemen, a handful of local hunters who knew the forest by muscle memory maps were unfolded on the hood of a squad car. Red grease pencil lines marking sectors to be swept. At the edge of the crowd stood Mariana's sister, holding a cup of coffee she would never drink, and the parents of each student, faces tight, eyes tracking every flashlight beam disappearing into the trees. The first layer of stories. At first, the explanation stayed simple. They'd taken a wrong turn on the ridge, a bridge or trail had collapsed, one of them was injured, and the rest stayed behind. Those were the kinds of possibilities people could live with, temporary dangers, not tragedies, the kind that implied tomorrow might bring them home. But as the days passed, and no tracks, no clothing, no broken branches appeared, the tone of the conversations changed, the stories deepened, hardened, the old warnings resurfaced. Long before the nature preserve was fenced and mapped, older residents claimed parts of it were wrong, not haunted. Haunting was too human a word, wrong in ways that made compasses hesitate, that made your memory of the path bend, that made sound seem to come from the wrong direction. One retired quarry worker told the sheriff had once heard his own voice calling to him from ahead on the trail while he was standing still alone. An elderly woman swore her father had forbidden her to go past the second bend in the creek, saying the trees there didn't keep to their places. These stories had become folklore, something to scare kids, something to dismiss with a smile. Until now, the town splits in two. By the end of the first week, 2 versions of the truth were circulating. Version 1, they had stumbled into an abandoned quarry vent or a hidden shaft, an accident, tragic, but explainable, maybe even recoverable if someone found the right spot. Version 2, the forest had taken them, not in the forest, by the forest, that something about that land wanted them, not found and was capable of making it, so the first version kept the sheriff's office moving. The second version kept people up at night. Artifacts in the wrong hands. A teenager claimed Head found a ring of char in the dirt near the creek with nails laid into and around it. He told 3 friends, then burned the nails in a fire pit to break the spell. Others swore they'd seen strange markings carved into fence posts on the trail that weak small circles with notches, but no one had thought to photograph them. Parents started telling younger kids not just to stay out of the forest, but to avoid the sound of running water in the preserve. It didn't matter that the advice made no sense. It was a shape for their fear to live in. The sheriff's silent sheriff Arnold Bevis was not a man given to speculation in public. He stuck to phrases like ongoing search efforts and no evidence at this time. But off record, he told his deputy something Head never told anyone else. Years earlier, while tracking a poacher in the same area, Head walked for what he swore was 3 hours in a straight line only to find himself back at his starting point without realizing. Head turned when the deputy asked if it could happen to 6 people at once. The sheriff said it could happen to more than 6 and left it at that. The vigil. By the end of the second week, the search shifted to vigils. People gathered in the school gymnasium, the smell of floor polish and folding chairs mingling with coffee and candle wax. Teachers cried quietly. The principal gave a speech about resilience. Someone read a psalm. Someone else read a poem about returning home. None of it landed in the back. A boy from another class whispered to his friend, "They're still out. They're just not in the same place we are." The section closes with the camera pulling away from the town entirely, the glow of its streetlights shrinking until darkness takes the frame. In the black, the hum from the forest is faint, but present just enough for the viewer to wonder if it's been there all along under the surface of the town's silence. The recovered notebook pages are laid out under protective glass in the evidence room, each numbered, each scanned into the archive. At first glance, they look like any field notes, measurements, quick sketches, times logged in the margins, but read in sequence. The tone shifts somewhere between page 6 and page 7. The scientific handwriting begins to lean towards something else, not just observation, but interpretation. First signs of the pattern. On one page, Jonah has drawn a perfect ring of small white fungi growing on the forest floor. Next to it, a crude compass rose shows that the ring sits exactly between east and southeast relative to their position. Arius entry just below reads, "Echo from Claps returns from northwest, no matter which way we face." Miguel's note follows. Compass needle is slow to settle like it's moving through syrup. Lena has taped in a Polaroid of a small spiral in creek foam tight as a fingerprint in pen. She's written it never breaks current, doesn't carry it away. The rosette diagram. Mariana's handwriting fills an entire page with an overlay of mapstry growth rings, old logging road curves, and quarry vent coordinates from a century-old survey. The lines intersect in a strange, almost floral pattern. A lopsided rosette. The hollow pine sits near the exact center. She's written in the margin, "If shape holds across scales, anomaly might be structural like a standing wave in sound." Her words are underlined twice. Time slips. Paul's page is short, only a few lines, counted 120 steps. Between pine and ridge, counted 120 steps. Again coming back, but never saw pine. Aria contradicts him on the next page. "We passed the pine twice, same steps, same times." Maybe there are 2. Miguel adds in his own book, "Feels like walking in a loop, but path isn't turning." Weird pressure in ears. The entries are dated, but not in order. Some have 2 dates. The hum and the needle. The hum that began faint and irregular is now logged with increasing precision. Arius watch times it at 2 seconds between pulses. Then 1:8, then 1:5 on the same page. Marianne records the compass deflecting each time the hum peaks. Jonah draws an almost childlike image of the pine trunk, with concentric circles radiating outward, as if the sound were rippling from its center. From measurement to language. Somewhere in these pages, the language changes. The neat, detached tone of data gives way to metaphor. Tree, like a clock with no hands. Ridge hum is faster, like the forest is holding its breath. Paths don't connect where they should. Something is folding them. Lena sketches the charcoal ring symbol from inside the pine again. This time, she draws faint lines radiating from it, connecting to smaller, incomplete circles, as though mapping a constellation. A disagreement in the notes. The sequence of entries hints at an argument. Miguel's handwriting grows sharper. "We should turn back. Teacher won't say it, but she's looking for something." Paul's next page contradicts him. "She is looking, but not for herself. She's trying to get us out." The Handwriting in Mariana's private notebook tucked in with the students' pages carries its own tension. They feel it now, too. Once you feel it, you can't pretend you don't. False north. One late entry smudged with dirt describes a test. They set the compass on a flat rock, waited for it to steady, then clapped. Once the needle swung 5 degrees west, hesitated, and returned. They repeated the test, facing different directions. Each time the needle deflected toward the hollow pine. No matter where they stood, Arya circles this result in red and writes, "Not north, not magnetic pine is center." The camera finds the symbol again in the modern day. The documentary camera cuts to a slow zoom on the original charcoal ring inside the hollow pine. For the first time, the audience notices faint scratch marks along the notch, tiny vertical lines, like tally marks. The forensics team can't date them, but the implication is unsettling. Someone may have been marking time from inside the hollow. By the end of this section, the notes no longer feel like a record of a class trip. They read like fragments from people already half inside something they can't name, measuring it, mapping it, even as it pulls them in. By the late 90s, when the notebook is recovered, the accompanying artifacts are a stranger collection than the town expected. They aren't found altogether, but over the course of months, scattered in a rough crescent between the ridge and the creek. Each object feels both ordinary and wrong, as though it had been kept somewhere else for years before being returned, softened, altered, slightly mistranslated by the forest. The first Polaroid. The first recovered item is a Polaroid of the hollow pines. Interior clearly taken by Lena. The light is dim but adequate enough to see the circular charcoal marking with its small notch a few inches below. Faint and almost invisible is another smaller ring. The edges of this second ring are sharper, less smudged, like it was drawn more recently than the original. Lena's handwriting on the bottom white margin reads, "Wasn't here before lunch." The boulder that moves 2 Polaroids surface next, each showing the same boulder, rounded, moss-covered with a long horizontal crack through its center. The first photo has Jonas standing beside it, hand on the rock. For scale, the second photo is taken from the same angle, but the background is different. The trees behind the boulder are thicker, and the light falls from the opposite side. The timestamps, handwritten by Arya, are only 9 minutes apart. Miguel's note, recovered separately from his notebook. Boulder by creek is on both sides of the creek. Now either there are 2, or it moved. The pencil with teeth marks a snapped no. 2 pencil is found inside a sealed plastic bag wrapped in a single strip of notebook paper. The paper bears only 1 sentence in Paul's handwriting. It chews back the scarf in the branches. A wool scarf, green and gray, turns up, snagged high in the branches of a spruce tree 15 feet above the ground. Miguel had been wearing it when they left the school that morning. In the notes, he admits to tying it low on a bush as a trail marker just before they reached the ridge. Lena writes in her entry for that same afternoon, saw Miguel's scarf in a tree before he tied it on the bush. Didn't tell him the match. A small tin of waterproof matches found unopened. Inside the tin, wrapped in waxed paper, is a piece of Polaroid film, undeveloped, its chemistry intact, but never exposed to light. The back bears an indentation, faint but legible, the charcoal ring symbol pressed into it like a seal. The echo test. The notes describe a group experiment Marianne devised. Stand in a perfect circle spaced evenly apart. Each person claps once, in order moving clockwise. Log the direction and delay of the returning echo. The results scribbled in uneven handwriting. Echo returns from opposite side of pine, regardless of who claps first. Delay varies, sometimes half a second, sometimes 3. Once the echo arrives before the initiating clap finishes, Paul adds in pencil, "I think it is answering." The disagreement intensifies. Miguel's frustration bleeds into the page. "We should have gone back after lunch. Teacher's not scared enough." Lena's handwriting smaller below his. "She's scared. She just doesn't want us to know." In Mariana's private notes, written the same day, "They're right to be afraid, but if incorrect, we're already inside the pattern. Leaving may not mean what we think it means." A photograph without a photographer. The last artifact is the one that disturbs the recovery team most. It's a Polaroid showing all 6 of them, Marianne and the 5 students, standing together at the base of the hollow pine. The framing is wide and steady, as if shot from a tripod. No one in the image is holding the camera. The light suggests early morning, yet the group had only reached the pine after midday. On the back, in Arya's handwriting, "Don't remember this being taken, but I think we all do." This section ends with the modern camera hovering over the recovered photographs, laid out in sequence, seen together. They feel like fragments from parallel versions of the same day, some overlapping, some contradicting, all refusing to settle into a single Timeline, the hum fades back and almost imperceptibly, as if the forest is leaning close to see whether we've begun to notice the pattern. By the time the handwriting turns confessional, the shift is unmistakable. The neat alignment of headings and data points starts to fray, lines run closer together, words crowd, margins, dates become less certain, and in between the soil readings and compass notes, personal admissions start to bleed through, as if the forest had loosened the grip they normally kept on themselves. These aren't the entries they'd read aloud in class. These are the things they only wrote down because the hollow pine was supposed to keep them safe. Jonah's secret. Jonah writes in a slanted, hurried scrawl, I used to sleepwalk. When I was younger, last night in the tent, I woke up, standing, no shoes, sap on my palms, felt like I'd been touching the inside of the pine. He doesn't tell Marianne or the others. He only adds in smaller handwriting below, I think it was warm inside. Lena's voice in the creek. Lena admits she heard her mother's voice calling her name while she was taking photos of the creek bend. It was wrong, not in pitch, but in shape of the sound, like someone using the right words in the wrong mouth. She writes that she took a photo toward the sound, but didn't look at it. Yet she seals the Polaroid between pages taped shut. The photo will never be found. Miguel's test. Miguel's tone is skeptical, but tinged with something sharper. Moved the scarf to see if it would put it back. Didn't tell anyone. 10 minutes later, it was gone from the bush. 15 after that, it was in a tree knot tied, woven between branches. He underlines the word woven 3 times. Arias route. Aria keeps sketching the charcoal ring symbol over and over. This time her notes are different. It's not a symbol, it's a route. Notch is the opening. Everything else loops back. But if you keep moving clockwise, you don't get back to the start, you get somewhere else. She doesn't say how she knows this. The margin next to it is smudged, as though she erased something. Paul's game. Paul's handwriting is the smallest, like he's trying to make the page hide it. When I was little, me and Eli would play a game, hold your breath until the other one tapped your chest. In the forest, I felt that, but nobody was there. The tap came from inside. He finishes with a single line that doesn't fit with the rest. I think the forest is holding its breath for us. Marianne's plea. For the first time in her private notebook, Marianne drops the scientific framing entirely. If we are lost, may whoever finds this know we were listening. We were not careless. We were trying to see the pattern. And maybe that was our mistake. Below it, a faint graphite smear that might have been the start of another sentence, then stopped. A shared shift. Reading them together, the recovered pages suggest a change in the group's relationship with the forest. What began as observation has turned to something intimate, almost reciprocal. The pine is no longer just a landmark, it's a confessional booth. The hum is no longer background, it's a presence. And in each entry, without exception, there's a subtle pulling away from the others. They stop speaking in we and start speaking in I. The section closes on the image of the notebooks in the hollow pine, as imagined by the documentary's reconstruction, stacked unevenly, now graphite words pressed close in the dark. The charcoal ring around them, like an unblinking eye. The hum is louder here, not menacing, just patient. By the time they reach the ridge, the air feels thinner, not from exertion, but from something subtler, as if the space between molecules has been pulled just a little farther apart. The hum is no longer an intermittent presence, it is a constant, like a bass line in a song. They can't remember the rest of From the Crest. They see it, a collapsed concrete ring half buried in moss and soil 10 feet across. Marianne recognizes it instantly, not from field maps, but from the century-old quarry survey she once copied by hand. This was a vent cap, part of an abandoned extraction system sealed decades ago. When the quarry closed, the shape revealed. Miguel kicks away leaves from the perimeter, revealing the ring's perfect circles stained darker in places where moisture has sunk in the notch. The gap matches exactly the small break in the charcoal symbol from inside the pine. Aria pulls out her notebook, flipping to her repeated sketches of that ring with notch design. She holds the page up next to the real thing. It's the same. She says it is the symbol. Jonah walks the circle slowly, counting his steps. 17, he says, but on the other side, it only takes 14 to get back here. He looks puzzled, then uneasy. The hum's source. They crouch near the vent's center. The hum is stronger here, not loud, but denser, pressing into their eardrums, making the ground feel subtly elastic under their boots. Marianne kneels and presses her ear to the concrete. The sound has structure. She can feel it pulsing like a measured signal. Her voice is calm but strained. This is where it's coming from. The pine is not the source, it's a receiver, a working hypothesis. In her private notes later recovered inside the hollow, Marianne tries to explain it. Acoustic trap, standing wave between 2 points, vent and pine, With harmonic interference, sound distorts orientation, compass deflection aligns, with pulse pathways fold. She underlines fold twice. She realizes that when they've been walking between these 2 points, they've been inside a kind of resonant corridor, not a tunnel in the physical sense, but a loop created by sound reflecting along certain contours of the land. Infrasound could bend perception, trick the vestibular system, make distances seem shorter or longer, turn a straight walk into a circle. Without anyone noticing the decision, Miguel insists they turn back immediately. We follow the creek to the road. Forget the pine, forget the notes. Just leave. Marianne shakes her head. If the pine is acting like a lighthouse in this trap, it might be the only way out. We can't just walk away from it. Arya agrees. If we move toward the center point, when the hum peaks, the compass should pull us straight to it, Jonah mutters. And if it pulls us somewhere else? No one answers. Testing the gradient, they spread out across the ridge, each holding their compass, waiting for the hum to peak. When it does, all the needles, every one, swings toward the pine's location. Marianne calls them back together. We follow the gradient. She says stay in sight of each other. If anyone feels dizzy or disoriented, stop and wait for the rest. In her private margin, she writes something darker. If path collapses again, we may have to split to triangulate. One group holds position, one advances. Risk separation could become permanent. The walk back, they start down the slope toward the pine. The hum rises and falls like breathing, but the time between pulses is shrinking. 2 seconds. 1815. Paul says it feels like the forest is urging them along, hurrying them towards something. Lena takes a photo of the path ahead. When the Polaroid develops, it shows them from behind as if the camera had turned around. Without her knowing the last entries, the recovered notes end abruptly during this return journey. Arya, needle steady feet, feel light. Might be going faster than we think. Miguel, sky feels heavier. Here, Jonah, tree ahead, or another tree wearing its face. Paul, hum isn't outside anymore. Lena, don't look back. Mariana's final line in her private notebook. If the tree keeps time, we can leave pieces of ourselves where time can find us. And then silence. The next page is blank. Whatever happened between that last sentence and the moment their absence was noticed has no surviving record, at least not in words. The section closes with a slow pan over the charcoal ring in the pine's hollow. This time, the tally-like scratches by the notch are clearer, more than before, unevenly spaced, as if marked in haste. The last one is only half-etched, trailing off into the grain. The hum fades into nothing. Or perhaps it simply falls below hearing. When the group failed to return by sundown on October 12th, the first search was urgent but casual. Just a few teachers and a pair of parents walking the trail with flashlights, calling names. By midnight, it had become official. Deputies, volunteer firefighters, local hunters, and anyone with a pair of boots showed up at the trailhead. The forest swallowed their voices almost immediately. The overlap that never registered searchers came within yards of the hollow pine. On the first night, they marked it on the map as large damaged tree, but didn't inspect the interior. No one thought to the flashlight beam slid over its scarred bark. Without pausing, one man swore he heard something metallic clink inside as he passed, but assumed it was wind rattling an old nail. He didn't mention it until years later. Echoes out of step. By the second day, people were noticing oddities. A deputy shouted for Miguel and heard his own voice return, not from the direction head called, but from somewhere to his left. Another volunteer complained that the compass in his kit kept pointing toward the ridge regardless of where he turned. None of these details made it into the official report. The focus stayed on covering as much ground as possible, not on puzzling over what the ground seemed to be doing. In return, the disturbances they made helicopter downwash scattered delicate rings of ash and pine needles near the creek formations. No one had placed their tire tracks from search vehicles cut across faint depressions in the moss that might have been footprints or might have been something older. A rescue dog handler reported her animal refusing to go near the vent cap on the ridge, pulling instead toward the creek bend and whining. The handler thought it was due to a wild animal scent. The false leads. On the third day, a pair of boots was found half buried in silt downstream. They belonged to neither the teacher nor any of the students. This discovery pulled manpower toward the river for 2 full days, chasing a lead that had nothing to do with the missing 6. A week later, a Polaroid camera, waterlogged and warped, was pulled from a tangle of roots. The film inside had degraded into a smear of blue and white. No one connected it to Lena until years afterward. Time works differently for the missing. By the 10th day, official operations scaled back. The sheriff spoke of transitioning to a recovery effort, the euphemism that tells families the worst is Expected, but a few locals kept going back on their own. One swore he saw a scarf green and gray flutter high in a tree where it hadn't been the day before. Another claimed he found a small piece of notebook paper in the mud, words smeared beyond reading except for a single penciled circle. These finds too vanished, either misplaced, destroyed by weather, or dismissed as unrelated. The last vigils in the woods. Even years later, some people still walked the ridge in silence, stopping by the pine, pressing their hands to the bark. They said it felt warm in winter, cool in summer. Few of them left small objects in the hollow, coins, scraps of fabric, a folded prayer. One of those coins would be found during the 90s. Discovery of the notebooks resting right where Mariana's final entry lay. The section ends with a wide shot of the forest as it was during those searches. Men and women in bright jackets scattered across a vast green-brown expanse, their presence impossibly small against the scale of the land the camera holds, just long enough for the audience to feel the irony. The missing were always close enough to touch, yet already somewhere else entirely. The pine stands alone now, though not in isolation. The forest has shifted around it over the decades, trees, falling saplings, rising paths, eroding and reappearing, but the hollow trunk remains steady and unchanged, as if the rest of the world is moving, and it is simply staying still. In late summer, when the light slants low, you can see deep into the opening. The bark edges are worn smooth by weather, and the inside walls hold the faint gloss of old resin. The charcoal ring is still there, darker now, its edges blurred into the grain. If you lean close, you can see the tally-like scratches by the notch, irregular in spacing, some overlapping as though made at different times by different hands. Modern curiosity. A modern-day acoustic researcher visits with a portable sensor. She knocks on the inner wall of the hollow, just a gentle tap. The sound comes back a fraction late and with a pitch slightly lower than it should be, like an echo returning from somewhere farther away than the inside of a tree. She repeats the knock at different intervals. On the fourth try, the return is quicker, almost anticipatory. She writes it off as equipment error, but her assistant doesn't put the sensor away right away. The names read aloud once a year at the small town's memorial gathering. Someone reads the names: Marian Cole, Jonah Hale, Aria McLean, Miguel Serrano, Lena Voorhees, Paul Kemp. The reading is simple, without speeches. Some years a family member attends. Other years it's just neighbors and former students. Always the gathering ends the same way. They walk to the trailhead and leave flowers at the base of the first marker. Few make it as far as the pine. Unanswered questions. The notebook pages remain locked in a climate-controlled archive. They're studied occasionally by researchers, folklorists, even crime writers. None agree on what happened. Theories range from geological oddity to psychological contagion to something unrecorded in science. One investigator, long since retired, once suggested that the forest might contain a geometry that isn't finished yet, as if the land was still folding and unfolding in ways humans aren't built to measure. The final image. The documentary closes on the hollow pine as the late afternoon wind moves through the canopy above. The leaves and needles shift in concentric ripples like the aftershock of a stone dropped in water. The light inside the hollow flickers, though nothing moves across it. The camera draws closer and closer until the dark fills the frame. For a moment, the hum, absent for decades, seems to surface low and patient, like something remembering how to breathe, and then it fades, leaving only silence or the sense that something is still listening.